Okay, let's get started. We have to finish today our of the economic growth production function. So last time we introduced the concept of a production function and saw some basic theory behind it, behind the use of this analysis for the purposes of theory of economic growth. Then we're going to go a few steps further and to complicate the analysis a few steps further, insofar as we are going to introduce a few additional factors here. As you remember, production function was defined as a mathematical function connecting together two independent factors of production, labor and capital, and a certain technological coefficient pertaining to the efficiency with which we use capital and labor. And you will also remember, just as a way of reminding you, that a type of analysis that we perform with the production function involves this assumption of variable proportions. So remember that just one factor is treated as variable and other ones as fixed. Remember this flower pot and crop stock in production of corn. The whole analysis that the purpose of the production function analysis is to show that there is an upper limit of how much you can increase production by varying one factor without doing anything to other complementary factors. So then production function is a line showing how much you can do by increasing one of the factors and keeping all the others constant. In our particular case, here we kept constant the quantity of capital goods and the degree of our technological knowledge or sophistication. So how much more we can produce by increasing the amount of labor we invest in production. And this curve gives you the answer that eventually flat lines, it has exponential growth at the beginning, which means it grows the GDP yield per unit, per one additional unit is higher and higher as you add new units until a certain point when we enter the area of diminishing returns. So we add new units of labor and the increase in yield goes down, it diminishes. It's diminishing returns and eventually flat lines, you reach a point when additional productivity that you get while keeping capital and technology fixed and increasing labor by one unit is zero. That's the upper limit. Remember the law of returns. What the law of returns says. Just kind of summarizes all of this. So any combination of one variable factor and multiple fixed factors, there is one finite optimal quantity of a variable factor that maximizes productivity. It's that you cannot definitely increase production just by adding new workers to the production process without adding new machines, new plots of land, factories, and so on. Okay, and we've seen then the effects of that for the macroeconomic markets. We've seen that increase in productivity, in real productivity, is shown as a shift of the long-run aggregate supply curve. So this is the former analysis. The long-run productivity will increase when, for whatever reason, quantity of labor is increased on a sustainable long-term basis. The long-run supply curve will shift to the right, which means the real productivity of the economy will increase. And it may also increase if one of the remaining two components increases. If the technological coefficient increases. Technological coefficient meaning the efficiency with which we use capital and labor, how well we use them, how productive we make them by by our technological knowledge, then the production function will increase. This will shift the whole curve, will shift, which means that with any given quantity of labor, let's say this is the quantity that we could have produced with a lower technological coefficient before. Now, when we increase that technological coefficient, then with the labor quantity of labor L1, or every 100 labor hours, we can produce more. Even if we don't increase the quantity of capital goods. Even with the same machines and the same tools, if they're better, technologically more productive, we can produce more. Or, alternatively, we can shift the whole production function upward if we increase the quantity of capital goods, new machines, raw material, new pieces of equipment added to the production process has the same effect of shifting the production function upwards. And moving, of course, the long-run curve to the right. So remember, the long-run curve can move to the right, either if we move along a given production function, or if we shift the entire production function. For the long-run growth, of course, we need to keep moving the production function upwards, because if you rely only on labor, adding more people to the production process, and don't increase the quantity of capital goods and don't improve technologically, you will hit the wall of diminishing returns. Eventually, you will end up, you will maximize the productivity at the given level of production structure, and that's the end. You cannot increase it any further. So then you have to add, to improve technologically, or to add more capital goods if you want a long-term sustained economic growth. So this is a very brief summary of what we did thus far, a simplified summary of what we did. That this is not the whole story. We're going to add a few more things here today. That there are other factors that contribute to productivity beyond capital and labor, and even beyond technological. And we will see what these factors are. Before that, we will explore a couple of things related to capital and labor. So, you see that increasing any one of these two factors will increase productivity. So now, I want to say something about the factors that may influence the change in the amount of labor and the amount of capital. Increase. What leads to society to deliver more labor hours? What will lead, which kind of policies, which kind of social changes will contribute towards greater capital formation or investment that will create more capital goods, such as machines, tools, buildings, so on. So that's the first thing, and then we will analyze in the second step other additional factors that contribute to productivity, such as entrepreneurship. And we'll analyze the relationship between entrepreneurship and technological change. And relationship of all of this to ideas, developments of ideas and knowledge. Well, that's a kind of complex of issues related to entrepreneurship and connection between entrepreneurship and technological change and ideas, the role of ideas in economic growth. And finally, we will explore, which is kind of connected with it indirectly with the previous, the role of institutions. Political institutions. So institutions can affect productivity greatly. None of this, 2, 3, and 4, was included in the original models of economic growth. Initial analysis of production function includes only capital and labor, and newest versions would include technological change, but wouldn't include entrepreneurship, would include institutions. So we'll see what the theory of economic growth looks like when we add institutions and entrepreneurship to the model. How does it help us clarify certain puzzles and certain problems that we observe in economic history, and also how does that complicate our life? How does that complicate our models? Okay, let's first start with the factors that contribute to the increase in labor or capital. So when it comes to labor, the most obvious one would be changes in the tax structure. Where income taxes are a major reason for a change in the amount of labor that will be provided in society. So income taxes discourage working. They penalize high income tax rates, especially progressive tax rates, graduated income tax, penalizes labor, penalizes work. People tend to work less, and they have to pay a higher percentage of their additional income. So tax reductions in income taxes will encourage more labor, more work. So if you have a simple situation here, you have wages on the vertical axis, and you have the quantity of labor on the horizontal axis, and if you assume that there is a certain precondition, certain demand for labor which is given, and you have a supply of labor at a given tax rate. That's the supply curve of labor. And you will have the economic equilibrium here that corresponds to the quantity of labor, L1, whatever it is, 200 labor hours per week in a certain community. So now what happens when income taxes go down? People decide to work more. Every single individual to some degree will increase their labor hour. So some people will start working who didn't want to work at all before. Some people will increase their labor hours. The total effect will be an increase in supply of labor. Okay. Lower taxes, people will work more because they retain a higher percentage of their income. It's a very simple rational calculation. This is shown as a shift of the supply curve on the right. When supply increases, supply curve shifts, and you have a new equilibrium point here that provides you greater quantity of labor. So this shift, this is labor market analysis here. This is what happens in the labor market. This here is macroeconomics, which means aggregate demand, aggregate supply analysis, and this is production market, or we can call it factor market. Capital, labor, entrepreneurship, and other factors of production. Factor market means market in which factors of production are being traded. So this is production function here. We keep labor is a variable factor. So this situation here, going from point 1 to point 2, would correspond, let's say, to this move from point 1 to point 2. Within a given production function. Increase the quantity of labor. This is just a labor market depiction of the same process we observe. Okay. This is just an explanation of interpretation of why is this happening. Okay. Income taxes go down, people will work more, That means that the supply of labor, quantity of labor that will be provided increases. That will increase then productivity. Even if you keep constant, if you keep the other two factors constant, that will give you higher real GDP. Okay, so that's labor. What about capital? Capital goods, our factor K here. L is labor, K is capital goods, is a collection of all artificial instruments of production. Machines, tools, equipment, buildings, and so on, and all intermediate goods. So now, what intuitively, when you think about capital formation, capital formation is a process of increasing the capital stock, increasing the quantity of capital goods. That's the process. Capital formation, so remember that's a technical term. Capital formation is an increase in the stock of capital goods. So, which factors influence capital formation? You can single out the two most important ones. First one would be corporate income taxes or profit taxes. Tax and profit influences capital formation. How does tax and profit influence capital formation? Can anyone try to guess? Let's say that we reduce profit taxes by 20%. How would that affect capital formation? How would it affect the creation of new machines, tools, equipment, pieces of equipment, and tools of production? Building new factories, building new buildings, and so on.
If the taxes are lower, you have more money to buy and create new.
So you keep a greater percentage of your profit, your shareholder, the owner, you can reinvest more. So this is the reinvestment pathway for increasing capital formation. So tax and profit reduces reinvestment. So reducing profit taxes will increase investment. Another term here, capital accumulation. That Karl Marx made famous, but economists, etc. So capital accumulation means just simply building up the capital structure, increasing the number and quality and quantity of capital goods. So tax and profit has a negative effect on capital accumulation. Reducing corporate income taxes and other profit taxes will incentivize reinvestment in the production process. More money being reinvested means more machines and tools and buildings being built. Greater productivity. This shift. K goes up, and you can produce then more with any given amount of labor. You can produce more if you create more capital goods. And corporate income tax reductions will contribute to that. The second factor, the second crucial factor is changes in the savings rate. Now, if somebody explains me this correctly, he or she may get an A. Macroeconomics doesn't have to take my life. If you give me a complete satisfactory explanation. How does the changes in savings rate affect capital accumulation? Can you walk me through the process? What's going on? By using all the tools that we developed. You don't have to get everything perfect, but essentially. Come on. And even if you don't get everything perfect, you may get a really good distribution of it. So who want to try?
Okay, so since the inflation rate.
No, savings rate.
Yeah,
Okay, good.
okay, so if the inflation rate goes up each year, then you're gonna have, so if,
No,
You know that-
sorry, sorry for interrupting you. We assume inflation rate is zero. This is long-term analysis. We are just looking at the real factors. So we don't worry about inflation now. Let's assume that inflation is zero. So forget about monetary policy, fiscal policy. Remember what I told you last time. We don't want to worry now about the short-term fluctuations. We're looking at it in the long run, behind the horizon. We're visionaries. We want to learn, want to predict what's going to happen in 10 years and 15 years, which processes influence the long-term trends. Okay, what is the savings rate? Let's start from the definition. What is the savings rate? Can somebody define that? What is the unit in which a rate is expressed? Percentage. Okay, so what kind of percentage is that? Savings rate?
Or the percentage that you don't spend.
Exactly. Percentage of what? Savings plus spending equals
Capital.
Individuals. We're talking about individuals.
Yeah.
So when you add my own saving and my own spending, what do I get?
Your income.
Income. Bingo. So savings rate is a percentage of income, not spent. Not spent. Okay. So when savings rate goes up, that's from 5%, 10%, that means the consumption goes down. 95% of income to 90%. What happens next? How does that affect the capital formation? What happens now on financial markets?
There's going to be less money circulating in the market because you're saving.
Okay, less money being spent, less money circulating in the short run. Okay. What happens to the interest rate? And by which process this happens? Savings rate goes up from 5% to 10% across the board, on average, in that community. How does that affect the interest rate? What determines the interest rate? What is the interest rate? If you want to use the supply and demand framework to analyze the interest rate. We use this graph quite a few times. You put interest rate on the vertical axis. That's a price. Price of what? Price of money. How much you would pay now for a given claim for a given amount of money in the future. On the horizontal axis, you have a quantity. It's price and quantity, the same supply and demand. So you have the demand for loanable funds here. That's a downward sloping curve. It's inversely correlated with interest rate. Higher the interest rate, people will demand less money to borrow because it's more expensive. Pay higher interest rate, you will be less likely to borrow money. You have the supply curve for loanable funds, which is often sloping like any other regular supply curve, which means that you're going to save more money if interest rate is higher because the rate of return on your investment is greater. So then, what is this point here? How would you describe that point? It's the equilibrium in the market for loanable funds, equilibrium in the market for credit. So you see, savings channels money into credit and to credit into investment. Savings, investment, and what is the last chain link? how savings affects our standard of living. Production. Savings rate goes up. That means that people will save 10% instead of 5% anymore. So that means that the supply of credit will increase. Because times preferences change. Our income doesn't change, but we decided we're going to be more frugal now. We're going to spend less and we're going to save more for whatever reason. So that will increase, no matter what the interest rate is, that will increase the amount of savings. The supply curve will shift, right? Supply of loanable funds. As that happens, this point here is the equilibrium interest rate. This point here is the equilibrium interest rate. What is this down here? How do you describe this? Magnitude, QE, what is that? Equilibrium quantity of credit, equilibrium quantity of money that changes hands from lenders to borrowers. This is the price at which transactions take place. Equilibrium interest rate. This is how much money changes hands. What happens when the supply curve shifts? When people provide more savings, credit money to the banking system, to the financial markets. Equilibrium point shifts over here. Okay. So now you have a new equilibrium interest rate here, which is smaller. So that's the effect, the most direct effect of a change of an increase in savings rate is the lowering down of real interest rate. But that's not the end of the story. The second aspect of the story is that the quantity of credit being exchanged will increase. That means that investment will go up. People will borrow more money and they will purchase more capital goods. Their money. Purchasing more capital goods will lead to higher productivity. So that's the reason why changes in savings rate, by saving more, we can afford to produce more in the future. And of course, this can give us more leeway for economic growth than just increasing the amount of labor. We can shift the production function by increasing the amount of savings. But now, of course, there are limits to this as well. You cannot save 105% of your income. Probably cannot save 50% either. You have to live. You have to buy stuff. You have to consume right now. So there are some relatively rigid upper limits of what percentage of individual income could be saved in the long run. So that means that there is a relatively sharp upper limit to economic growth, which is based only on savings. Yes, we can go from 5% to 10%, to 15%, to 20%. Well, let's say 20% is the maximum that we can do. Let's say that this curve corresponds, this increase corresponds to 20% increase in savings rate, as the capital accumulation increases as much. And that's the end of the story. That you increase investment, you increase the labor participation, wherever the maximum is, and sooner or later you will end up like this, and you cannot go anymore. You're at steady state. You just keep going at the same pace. You cannot increase investment anymore because you're at the upper limit, how much you can sacrifice. You cannot increase the amount of labor anymore because you were at zero return on labor here. See, that's the end. So essentially, the long-term economic growth of the kind that we are familiar with in the last 200 years cannot be based only on capital and labor. that is the realization that the economic theory came to over the course of the 20th century. This factor here is crucial. The only way to keep shifting production function, that's how economic growth comes about, right? Constantly shifting the production possibilities, production function upwards. You can do it in the long run only if you keep increasing the technological efficiency of use of a given quantity of capital and labor. And that's exactly what the modern economic growth has been based on the last 100 years. Increased technological efficiency. That we can get more out of any given unit of capital and labor as time goes by. Not only that we have more machines, but we have better machines. Better machines make labor more productive. Then you can get from a given labor hour, you can get much higher yield. Better technology. One machine and one worker can give you much more than before. So it's not only that you want to increase the number of machines from 1 to 20, you want to have the 20 machines that are 10 times, 20 times, 30 times more productive than machines 100 years ago. So one example that is sometimes useful for us to understand to what extent technology is important. We now feed 8 billion people much higher calorie intake per person in 2021. As compared to feeding something like 1.5 billion 100 years ago. And we use 3% less arable land. That 3% less acreage. So we converted quite a bit of former arable land to pristine wilderness. How did we pull it off? By saving 99% of our income? No, but by increasing the efficiency of agricultural production. Green revolution, what is this? Creation of hybrid sorts, genetical modification, modern machines and tractors and fertilizers and so on. We increased productivity, greatly increased the yield. And most of that increase comes from better and superior knowledge, technological application. So that applies to all branches of business. Transportation costs. You can sell, what is the reason that you can buy bananas for such a cheap price? It has to do with airplanes. It has to do with cutting transportation costs. So now, remember when we talked about trade. Trade is productive. We said that trade is economically productive because it ships, it moves resources, it moves products, consumer goods from the place where they're valued less to the places where they're valued more. Everything that facilitates this process increases our economic well-being. So everything that cuts transportation costs makes some goods that were non-tradable goods before, which means they were not the subject of international trade. In the 18th century, bananas were not tradable goods. Because it will take you more time to ship bananas from Jamaica or wherever to England than they can withstand. We didn't have acetylene, a substance that we now sometimes use. You pick a banana which is not yet ripe, and you then can transport it for whatever, for a few weeks or whatever, and wait until it ripens without losing its properties. You couldn't do that 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and now you can ship it in like 6 hours. there. So now bananas are tradable goods because transportation costs. So technology is the only pathway among the classical factors of production that can provide for a long term, in principle, unlimited economic growth. So then the limits of economic growth are limits of human knowledge. And since human knowledge doesn't know for limits, then the economic growth doesn't know for limits either. There's no limits of how much we can improve our standard of living. Internet, can you imagine how much more wealth and income is being created by people having the access to the World Wide Web? You probably cannot because you grew up with it. You don't remember the world before the internet, and I do. I can tell you, it's a different world. How many more opportunities people have because of the internet? How much easier it is to get in touch with other people, with employers and employees, greatly reducing the costs of cooperation, which reduces the cost of production. So that's technology, technological change. But also, now we come to those factors that were neglected, entrepreneurship. Why is entrepreneurship important? Traditional models couldn't quite capture the significance of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is a process of organizing production process, combining those three factors together, discovering the most superior forms of production. And it can have a couple of different aspects. So the first aspect of entrepreneurship would be the use of the application of technological knowledge for production processes. So it's not enough that somebody discovers something interesting. It takes an entrepreneurial genius to employ a given technology to the benefit of the consumer. So I'll give you the example. You know what was the source of the internet? Who invented the internet? It was not Al Gore, by the way. Who started using the internet? And for what purposes?
The government?
Yeah, the American military. And they used the internet just as a means of facilitating the interdepartmental communications, to cut the paper, to facilitate the communications, internal communications within Pentagon, Department of Justice. And then it took Bill Gates and other entrepreneurs to figure out that there is quite a bit of benefit here to be created for consumers, that this could be commercialized in a sense that some people will pay for the product, that this could be used in a wider setting apart from the government departments. So it's not enough to have technological knowledge, scientific knowledge. Somebody needs to figure out a way of using that technology. You know, when the steam engine, the steam engine that was the basis for industrial revolution. You know who discovered the steam engine? Who is credited for patenting and using the steam engine in England? There's one guy, James Watt, entrepreneur James Watt, 18th century. You know, when it's the steam engine, we have the surviving images, the surviving sketches of steam engines. The first century AD, 2,000 years ago, people knew about the steam engine. But what was missing? What was missing was a James Watt to figure out that you can use the steam engine as a means of economic production, making people's lives easier. That you can make something that you can sell to other people by using the steam engine. So this increase in the technological coefficient is not just that we discover new science. Is that we discover new science that is then applied in the production process. And this takes entrepreneurship. This takes this process of figuring out how am I going to use this particular technology to earn some money. Now, in order to get, why was that why was it that in England people discovered how to use the steam engine rather than in ancient Egypt, where the first sketches of steam engine apparently came from? Printing press, Chinese discovered that. Many other technological, it's a very few of technological, the original, the big time technological discoveries were made by Western peoples. And yet most of the application, practical application of those discoveries were made by Western people. Why is that? How come that the Chinese were not at the forefront of? They're not stupid people. Oh, they're Indians and Chinese. It's very sophisticated scientific races, or not races, nations, whatever you want to call it, civilizations. Yeah, that's the best. How come Americans are the most significant entrepreneurs in the history of the 20th century? Out of 10 of them, 9 are Americans. James Watt, Henry Ford, John D. Rockefeller, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Jeff Bezos, Andrew Carnegie, you name it. All most important entrepreneurs are Americans. Why is that? Not all the scientists. You see, if you say are Americans are the smartest people in the world, maybe they are, but not all scientists are Americans. Contribution of European scientists is maybe greater than contribution of Americans. Quantum mechanics was invented by Europeans. General theory of relativity, gravity, all kinds of stuff was invented by Europeans. And yet, somehow, in entrepreneurship, Americans are ahead of everybody else. So, it can help you if you think about entrepreneurship in a wider context. The application of new technological knowledge to create marketable consumer goods, that's one aspect of entrepreneurship. But there is also other things. There are also other things. Organizational changes and managerial that also can influence productivity. So what is a firm? A firm is an institution in which a team of people produce something joint. If you are to be a successful manager, you have to make sure you have to develop techniques, procedures, and institutional know-how, as they say. Know-how is non-tangible asset to control the firm, to extract as much as possible from a given human and capital inputs. That means to prevent people from shirking and to extract as much as possible from every individual team member, to monitor the performance. That's one. And another one is to combine your workers in a team that will work together in a complementary fashion. Complement each other. It's my favorite example of Real Madrid, Galacticos team from the early 2000s. You had 7 or 8 best players in the world who never won anything because their manager couldn't make them work together. And Luis Figo and Zinedine Zidane and Ronaldo da Silva, the Brazilian, and Raul and Roberto Carlos playing together. You have 7 or 8 geniuses, every one of whom wants to be the main brains behind the team. Nobody wants to do the stupid work. So then you cannot have a team like that. So you have to develop a corporate culture and the techniques of how are you going to make your team work well together. And that's American business has by far the best entrepreneurial culture. So one example, just one example to illustrate this. In England, you have the same industry, the same machines, essentially, same workers, English. That's one difference. American owners and top managers and English owners and top managers. 40% difference in productivity. Because of the corporate and managerial culture, which is superior in America. It's corporate know-how. That's another thing. Henry Ford, what did he do? Yeah, the assembly line, doesn't matter. Capital and labor are the same. You don't increase the number of workers, you don't increase the the machines and production, you don't increase even the technological efficiency. Everything is the same, just you organize them better. That's an entrepreneurial innovation. Now, the question is why Americans are consistently beating everybody else in all of these things? That requires a deeper thinking now. Why this experimentation with new stuff? Whenever we need to experiment with new things, to discover new things, Americans are somehow better than anyone else. It may have something to do with the Declaration of Independence, pioneering spirit. The spirit of individualism. Everybody has a chance to try. There are no hierarchies. There's no nobility in America. You were prevented because of whatever, all problems and racism or whatever you want to call it, that American society has had throughout history. It's one of the most egalitarian societies on the face. Everybody has a shot. American poor consider themselves to be not yet millionaires. As this aspirational society in Europe, poor people are a class for themselves, and they very usually detest developed people. There's this social gap. In America, that's not quite the case. So my favorite example, you know, this pioneering spirit I'm talking about. So see, it has influence on productivity of the economy. How American frontier was set. What was the role of the government in that? Pretty much zero. Anyone likes to listen to the band, the Dire Straits? Anyone heard? Yeah, Dire Straits. So you heard the song Telegraph Road? You know, that's a story about the American pioneers. A long time ago, came a man on a track, walking 3 miles with a sack on his back. He dropped his load when he thought it was the best, built a cabin in the wilderness. And then came the lawyers, then came the church, then came the schools, then came the machinery of government and civilization. That's a man on a track walking 3 miles with a sack on his back, and he built a cabin on the wilderness wherever he thought it was the best. That's how it works in America. That's only in a country like that you can have a Bill Gates, or Jeff Bezos, and John D. Rockefeller. People who do outrageous stuff and then became trillionaires and billionaires. You know, in Canada, as a contrast, how the settlement of the Canadian prairies and Canadian frontier happens. With the government building the railroad and sending the mounted police to secure the area, to clear off the Indians and to make arrangements with them, to build the basic infrastructure and then to invite the population. Once everything is safe and secure, and government provided the basic principles. That has deep influences over how people think and culture. And differences in culture then affect economic production. So now you see, once you start to get more realistic, this might be the main lesson here, and I finish with that. Whenever you want to be more realistic and more complete in your description of an economic phenomenon, you get less scientific, less precise, and you get more philosophical. Liberty, culture. You're now starting from capital and labor. We now ended up with learning about culture and liberty and history, and Mark Knopfler at Dire Straits is explanations of productivity. So there is no way to avoid this. That's the way it is. Okay, there will be no homework now in the spirit of Easter. We'll skip the homework right now for this particular chapter. So I'll see you all then next Wednesday. So I wish you a happy Easter, restful break, and we'll continue once we're back.
What is that?